My name is Doug Schauer. I am 40 years old now officially. I was born in Camden, New Jersey, which was kind of a pretty rough town out in that area. Had my mom, dad, and my brother. We were all just kind of a small family, and my grandmother as well. In fact, growing up, because we lived in such a rough neighborhood, my parents oftentimes would leave me with my grandmother because it was a little bit safer where she lived. Growing up, my relationship with my parents was I was always closer to my mom. My dad and I were always very different. Well, my my mother came from an Irish Catholic family, so I was raised Catholic. My father was raised Lutheran, but he didn't practice, so I was raised as Catholic. I was baptized as an infant, went through Catholic school, did Holy Communion, first penance, all that good stuff, and even confirmation when I was in 8th grade. So once I got to the point where I didn't have any more requirements that I had to fulfill, there wasn't much reason for me to go at that point. When I first started college, I ran into some trouble because, well, I was a musician, got myself into a band, started playing lots of frat parties, and definitely got myself into some trouble with alcohol. And during that time was definitely a very rapid descent in my performance and my grades. I had met a girl who was much more academically minded than I was at the time, and to kind of appease her, I started taking my academics a little bit more seriously. And from that point on, I was essentially a straight A student for the rest of college. Yeah, I got my bachelor's degree from Drexel University in Philadelphia, and that was back in 2002. Well, at that point, I decided I was going to go to graduate school. Looked at a couple of different schools, wound up deciding on the University of Notre Dame, and basically that next August, I shipped out 700 miles away from home. For me to move all the way out to Indiana was a big transition, not just for me, but also for my family as well. My parents did not deal well with it. My brother didn't deal well with it. At that point, he was in high school, and he was having a tough time. At the end of my first year of graduate school, I had decided that it was time to end my relationship with the girlfriend that I had all through college. After a year at Notre Dame, I met my wife. We started dating in July of 2003, and we wound up getting engaged that following Easter, and then we were married the following May. At the point that I had gotten married, my personal faith was weak at best. I really wasn't focusing on my faith at that time. My wife was much stronger in her faith, and she was attending a non-denominational Christian church. And I went and I worshiped with her at that church for a long time. It was a big change in terms of my religious experience. To go into a church that had rock music playing and a fiery pastor, that was something that was very new to me. We continued going to that church for a while. In fact, we had intended to get married at that church. But when we went to do our premarital counseling, I found out that they needed me to be baptized before I could be married in their church. And I said, well, I was baptized. I was baptized as an infant. They said, no, you have to have been able to make the conscious decision for yourself to follow Christ. And I'm like, well, I got my confirmation when I was 13. Doesn't that count? They're like, no. And I was very angry at that because I felt like they basically told me that my entire faith for my entire life was garbage and didn't count. And we decided to leave that church. And then from there, we moved on to my wife's church, or my wife's grandmother's church, which was a Methodist church down out in Elkhart. And that's where we wound up getting married. And that's where I started getting a little bit more involved in my faith. I got involved in the church band there. Actually, during that time, while I was in graduate school, one of the people who were working in the laboratory with me started dating a girl who was very strong in her faith, and we actually began doing Bible studies at our laboratory laboratory during lunchtime. And that's where things started growing. I started doing a lot more reading in the Bible, trying to understand my faith. And it was tricky for me because at that point in time, I knew a fair bit of science, and everything that other Christians were telling me was trying to convince me that the science that I was learning was wrong. It took me a long time to sort my way through that because, I'm a scientist. That's what I do. But I have been able to find that science and religion actually coexist. The world was created by God. God had the ability at any given time to snap his fingers and create the entire universe as we know it today. He also has the ability to make a mountain grow right outside of this building right now if he wanted to. But he doesn't. He has his way that he does things. And I think that what science does is that it reveals the way that God did things. It doesn't refute what he did. We worshiped at Calvary United Methodist Church for the entire time that I was in graduate school. One of the things that happened to me when I was in the first couple of years of grad school, after I had been dating my wife for maybe about a year or so, I wound up in the hospital for another one of my kidney stone surgeries. And the surgery itself went fine. But there was a problem with the procedure that we found out about afterwards, just as I was about to leave the hospital. When they pulled the tube out of my back, they wound up collapsing one of my lungs, which caused a terrible infection. And I almost died. They even called in a Catholic priest to give me the last rites and all that. But the Catholic priest had denied me communion because of the fact that I had been attending a Protestant church. And I think that might have been one of the first steps along the way for me to realize that my relationship with God is something more personal, that there's no person who stands between me and God, who can separate me from God. When we first moved down to Lafayette, we started doing some church shopping, for lack of a better term. We looked at a couple of different churches and never really found a great fit. There was a Methodist church down there that we went to, and I guess it was good enough. We went there for a while, but it was fairly large. Right after Becca was born, we realized that most of the people in the church had no idea that Becca was born, which told us that maybe we weren't forming the relationships that we needed to form in church. And of course, we blamed it on the church itself. So instead of reaching out to other people and trying to integrate ourselves into the congregation, we decided to look at other churches. It turned out to be a really good thing because we found a great church. It was a small church downtown. There were people from all walks of life that were part of the church. I played in the band there too. Our drummer had an ankle bracelet for work release. But it was so genuine. And it showed me that my faith was not founded in a building. It wasn't in a pastor. It wasn't in a doctrine. My faith was in my relationship with God. And this church was just there to bring me closer, to help me realize my faith more strongly.
You make everything glorious. You make everything glorious. You make everything glorious, and I am yours. What does that mean?